Hello, I'm Marina Johnson, and this is TABLEWORK, a TAPS podcast series where we interview the artists and theater makers behind our productions on what it takes to get their productions from the page to the stage. This episode features TAPS PhD student Kathy Fang, who is choreographing and performing in her Grad Rep piece, Hard to Say, Still Untitled. Grad Rep is a project meant to showcase the work of our second-year graduate student artist scholars. Join us as we learn more about Kathy's project. Hi, Kathy. I'm so excited to get to talk to you today about your Grad Rep piece.
Hi, Marina. Thank you for having me.
Of course. To start off with, can you share a little bit about the ideas or questions that you're currently exploring in your PhD work?
In my PhD work at large, I'm currently working on issues of immigration, tech, performance, and the staging of immigration through specific technologies in performance. This graduate project builds on a secondary research interest of mine in translation and language learning, which is deeply informed by my background in comparative literature.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And thank you. What a succinct, great answer. I think in second year, it's really sometimes hard to synthesize all of your ideas in this way. But I love getting to hear from you about this. And grad rep is certainly a big part of the second year of the PhD. Can you tell us about the project itself that you're working on, which, as you told me, is the title is Hard to Say, parentheses, Still Untitled. So what is the project? And then what sparked the idea for you?
Like I mentioned, my bachelor's degree is in comparative literature and theater, and those two fields have been deeply intertwined from the beginning for me. In my previous directing work was inspired in large part by this idea of translation as a dramaturgy. I was doing some field work in France on my undergraduate thesis that involves thinking about Chinese language theaters and the way they were engaging Chinese in a French context. And to me, it seemed like an opportunity to take the weird experience that is speaking Chinese as like a script for blocking. Um, that's the context in which this dance piece emerges. That was in a theater context. Now I'm interested in taking really seriously this idea of language learning as an embodied learning as well. It's also informed by my own experience growing up in a Chinese dance studio. I was trained at like this little family-owned studio run by two first-generation Chinese immigrants who used to perform in national ballets in China. And for me, the space of their dance studio was also my Chinese language learning classroom. So for this piece, hard to say, still untitled, I'm drawing on both of these experiences of mine to create a dance that thinks about the way that languages move us. How can we draw from the feelings that come up in translation exercises, the feelings that come up in the language classroom, and expand them into a choreography of its own, a choreography of thinking about language as learning, as pedagogy, as relationality.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. Well, and who are you collaborating with on this dance piece? How's that collaboration going, and how is that shaping the work?
I was really lucky to meet four fabulous dancers in Alex Ketley's choreography class last quarter. I'm working with Robert Igbokwe, Dakota Gelman, Jessica Lee, and Kendall Johnson on this piece. And I guess my official title is choreographer, but we are really devising this dance piece. So I'm mixing kind of irreverently my theater and dance training in approaching the making of this piece. And 3 weeks ago, quite late in the process, I got to know someone I've been in a PhD reading group with, actually, Gary Huertas, in the Latin American Studies department here at Stanford, and I found out that he plays the accordion. So my artistic brain was so excited upon this discovery, I had to invite him onto the project. So he's since joined us, and he's composing live music in conversation with the score of the piece, which will be Keith Jarrett's Cone Concert Part 1.
Oh, amazing. Okay, wait. So tell us a little bit more about the music. What's the sonic landscape that we're in for?
Yeah. So in many ways, Keith Jarrett is the sixth collaborator on this project. I was deeply moved by my first experience listening to the Cone Concert, which kind of came at my first crisis point in the PhD when I was feeling a little bit unmoored at Stanford. And this concert is completely improvised and makes that feeling of wandering, of being lost, sound so beautiful. And to me, that was the soundtrack of my summer doing the language learning program that Stanford generously sponsors for first year PhDs, and also an encapsulation of an idea I've been wrestling with for a few years now of translation as an improvisatory gesture. Um, so the music for us is more of an interlocutor than than per se a background or a score to the movement. We are devising movement, not so much in set to the music rather, but devising it to be put into conversation with the music at a later rehearsal. So in the studio room, I will present a prompt or an exercise or a question to the dancers, along with a framework for making movement to explore that particular prompt, question, idea, and then after making the movement, I will go back to the music. I will find the part in the music that sort of resonates with this idea that the dancers have brought out. Um, and only then will we start to put those two things together. So it's a little bit maybe of an unorthodox approach to choreography to music, um, but it's very exciting. And I think it also opens up. I'm really interested in opening up more spaces for conversation in the studio, unexpected spaces for conversation in the studio. So I'm excited that this approach feels exciting to Gary, who is sort of finding his own voice in this translation jumble.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds really exciting. And I mean, you're talking about this unorthodox approach, but it sounds beautiful. Like you're taking the pieces, you're really evaluating what you need, what the piece needs, and not prescribing something to it, really seeing sort of what shape it's authentically taking and guiding it in that way, which I think is such an important job as a choreographer or a director. I have a question about your collaborators, and they sound amazing. How important to them are some of the central questions that you've brought up around translation and around language? I'm sure these are conversations you're having, but I'm curious, like, does everyone have we don't all have similar lived experiences. And I'm curious, like, what that looks like in the room and how those conversations are emerging.
In pitching the project to the 4 dancers and also to, the musician, I laid out my own investment in the project to make room for their possible personal connections to it. Dakota is majoring in comparative literature at Stanford and has sort of a similar point of entry, but the other dancers have various points of entry, some more personal, some more related to dance as, like, a language of expression in an abstract sense, others simply, with a specific interest in movement itself and in different ways of getting to movement. So this for them is just another thing to explore in their journey as dancers. Um, and for Getty, he is also interested in questions of bilingualism, which was a point of resonance for us that I found really exciting in our PhD work and also in our artistic collaboration.
That's incredible. One of the most beautiful things about these kinds of collaborations is finding like the common ground, but also then finding the other places for exploration too.
Mhm.
So you've already very generously walked us through a lot of your process so far, but I would love to see if there are any places that we haven't touched on yet, about your process from the beginning to where you are now, that you want to share about, yeah, how this process has emerged for you.
This piece was originally conceived as a duet, then it became a solo project, and now it's a project with 5 collaborators on stage and Keith Jarrett on the music. So I think that trajectory says a lot about the ethos of the project in that I'm really invested in, or rather, I'm really interested in the ways that translation language learning asks us to give ourselves up to someone else, whether it's a teacher, a partner, interlocutor, another language in its entirety. And I think exploring those themes in dance, which is so much about giving yourself, especially your body, up to the imagination of a choreographer or the trust of a partner. That has been really rich in the rehearsal room. And I'm so grateful that these dancers who have worked with each other in the past, and I'm grateful that they have that established choreographic relationship already. I'm always inspired by their willingness to play with each other, not just play with the prompt, but explore with each other, trust each other, lean into each other. That has become more central than I was expecting at the beginning, but actually feels really true to the research ethos of the project.
Wow, very nice. And also speaks to the room that you're creating where these kinds of relationships can emerge and happen. Grad Rep really emphasizes the idea of the artist scholar, which is something we talk about a lot in theater and performance studies, especially in our program, where creating work is a big part of our process. And that's not always the case for people who are creating scholarship in these ways. You've already talked to us a little bit about how this project brings your creative practice and your academic research into conversation, but I would love for you to share more if you feel like you can sort of expand upon some of these ideas, or even if there are realizations or revelations you've been having in the dance studio that you feel are worth sharing. That would be great too.
I haven't actually written about dance, and I think I'm realizing why in the dance studio. It's really hard to talk about dance. This is back to that feeling that the dance studio and the language learning classroom are more similar than we might think. And I think that is in its own way making its way into my research. This is a little bit of a plug, but I'm running with a PhD in ethnomusicology, John Fath, a reading group called the Invisible Syllabus Reading Group. And this year, the concept is that we read texts that are on the quote unquote invisible syllabi of PhD classes, texts that are always cited but never taught. And this year, we're reading Jacques Derrida, one of my favorites. And Derrida's work thinks a lot about writing and the voice and language, but not so much about embodiment. And I think it's been really fruitful to have this project emerge alongside that very theoretical, very research heavy one, as maybe possibly offering an inroad for me to think about dance from a scholarly perspective. I think I've been shy on that front because it's so hard to write and talk about dance. But actually, this project has encouraged me to lean into that difficulty as maybe a fruitful ground for further research. Stay tuned.
I love that. I also love the idea of an invisible syllabi. Yeah, the PhD, there are so many things that because we're all coming from different backgrounds and we're in interdisciplinary classrooms often, there are things that we're expected to have read or that really are just at the heart of some of the scholars that we're citing. So what we might not, I mean, maybe you are citing Derrida a lot, but even if I'm not, I know that this person was influential to so many of these other scholars. And so knowing their work is really paramount. So thank you. That's a really cool plug. I hope people that are listening take you up on it. And I'm assuming if they don't come this quarter, they could still come next quarter, correct?
You can join us anytime.
Amazing.
Email me for details.
Um, so part of Grad Rep is working with design in different ways, and for different choreographers or directors, it's important in different ways as well. Is there a particular element of the piece, whether that is, I don't know, a scenic design? I mean, we've already talked about your sonic landscape, which is so rich. The costumes, like, is there anything about that that you're really excited to explore or that you have explored that you would want to share?
I think sound and music for me is the biggest player in all of this. I wish I had the time to think more about costume and scenic design. But speaking of the unwieldy process that is grad rep, this might be for a future iteration of the project. Uh, I do think, though, in terms of thinking about choreography as its own form of design, something I'm invested in is or something I'm really inspired by, rather, is the clean lines and like the attention to movement that the American ballet tradition, started mostly by Balanchine, sort of emphasizes. And that's an aesthetic that I'm hoping to bring into this piece as well.
Oh, very nice. And you're right. I mean, the clean lines, I think, do a lot. So there are ways that the movement is giving us different aesthetics too, without a scenic design, like in a, I don't know, traditional sense. And as people who are listening probably know, grad rep is a really short, truncated process that is so full of twists and turns. And so getting to focus on the pieces you've already told us about is really gorgeous. And I know that I'm looking forward to seeing your piece. But speaking of, the audience coming, when the audience encounters the work, what do you hope stays with them afterward? Are there questions or feelings or conversations you hope it opens up?
Part of the early struggle I had with this project was the question of how transparent to make the research part of it. Meaning, is this a work that I want to stage explicitly as like, here, I'm using dance to look at these theoretical questions, or is this a work that I want to um, encase in a kind of aesthetics surface, and leave the theoretical questions on the inside? Um, there for anyone who might be curious enough to probe as deeply as that, but like not in any way in the spotlight of the actual performance. I think where we settled somewhere in between, which is kind of cliche, but the prompts and like the various motivations for movement that the piece moves through um, remain a little obscure. I'm trying not to be too heavy-handed or didactic about the ethos of this project, and I am hoping that what the audience will see is really interesting and somewhat mysterious movement that comes from somewhere else, even if that somewhere else feels a little unplaceable. I'm hoping that this work feels intriguing and interesting in that kind of from that space of alterity, from an unplaceable feeling of unfamiliarity. In other words, I'm hoping that this piece evokes some of the feelings that come up for us in learning foreign languages or in existing environments that don't speak the same mother tongue as we do.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really rich provocation. I mean, I do love also that you're not, you're not being didactic. You're not, there isn't something specific and concrete you're having people walk away with, but because you're putting so much thought and so many questions into the space, undoubtedly we will all walk away getting to ponder different aspects that you've brought up. So thank you so much, Kathy. This has been such an invigorating conversation. And I know that I can't wait to see your piece, and I'm sure others feel the same way. So we will see you at Grad Rep.
Thank you, Marina. I will look forward to that.